Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Marcos Orellana. I am the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights. This is a special procedure of the United Nations Human Rights Council that is tasked with monitoring and reporting on toxics issues around the world. It was created in the understanding that exposure to hazardous substances and wastes can have a range of adverse effects on the effective enjoyment of internationally protected human rights. I am very pleased to have the opportunity to share opening words with you in the context of the South African People's Tribunal on agrotoxins. Today, I have three baskets of issues to elaborate on. The first one is that the use of highly hazardous pesticides is aggravating the toxification of our planet. This results from unsustainable model of large-scale industrial agriculture. It has local and global implications. A couple examples. Certain hazardous pesticides, such as methyl bromide, affect the ozone layer. Certain hazardous pesticides are also persistent. They're persistent organic pollutants. At the local level, mostly, but also at the global level, pesticides have adverse impacts on human rights. We can see this in various stages, such as in production. Last year, we commemorated the tragedy in Bhopal, India, where the release of a highly hazardous gas in a pesticide production facility killed thousands overnight and many more over the years to come. But also in regards to storage, the case involving UPL in Durban is quite striking. I'll come back to that. And certainly exposure during use. This is particularly affecting workers in the field and thus compromising the right to a safe and healthy working environment that has been recognized by the International Labour Organization as one of the fundamental principles and right at work. There are millions of people around the world that every year see their right to health compromised. The figures speak about 380 million people poisoned with pesticides every year. This leads to illnesses such as diabetes, Parkinson's, infertility, cancer, Alzheimer's. In addition, tens of thousands of people die every year from pesticide exposure. This has clear implications for the right to life, as has been affirmed by the United Nations Human Rights Committee, that is tasked with overseeing compliance and implementation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. In a case involving Paraguay, it found that aerial fumigations and the pesticide drift that affected local communities compromised and the right to life, and spoke to the failure of the state to protect people in its jurisdiction. But not all people are equally affected. Highly hazardous pesticides have disproportionate impacts on women and girls in the fields. This is in part because there are more women and girls that work in the fields than men, but also because of physiology, the implications for fertility, the impacts of miscarriages, stillbirths, various forms of cancer. They speak to reproductive justice issues. There's also transgenerational impacts involving the exposure to highly hazardous pesticides. Children born with malformations, children affected in their neurodevelopment. This is, of course, all quite sobering. But more generally, I will observe that spreading poisons in the environment reflects a human alienation from the natural environment. And so dealing with pesticides poses the challenge upon us of how to reconcile with nature and how to enhance our consciousness in the understanding that a healthy environment is the foundation of our collective well being. This issue of highly hazardous pesticides is a global issue. It involves shared responsibilities of exporting and importing countries involved in international trade on pesticides. Industrialized countries certainly have responsibilities, while many of them have put in place restrictions on highly hazardous pesticides for use in their territories. Many nevertheless allow their production for export. Now, this is blatant double standard. It is a practice that reproduces long-standing racist and colonial patterns of exploitation. Let me delve a little bit deeper on this. Sometimes we hear arguments that for industrialized countries, it makes no sense to put an end to the production for export of banned pesticides because production would simply be displaced to other countries, and so its industry would be disadvantaged. It would lose business. Now, the immorality of this argument is too obvious to need further elaboration. What I'll say is that leadership must confront the economic costs of doing the right thing. We also hear the argument that not the environment in different countries is of course different, and so varying environmental conditions justifies the use of highly hazardous pesticides in one place that may be banned in another. Now, this is largely as another sophism in practice, because the human body is the same everywhere. We're all members of the human family. What varies, however, is the lack of capacity of the government institutions to deal with the risks imposed, especially on people in vulnerable situations. And another argument that we hear is that governments in the global south importing countries are sovereign to determine whether they wish to ban the import of highly hazardous pesticides or not. That as long as there's compliance with national law, there's really no problem. Now, again, this argument underscores the lack of capacities in many, if not most, developing countries that are involved in international trade on pesticides. It also obscures the fact of corruption or corporate capture of government institutions that takes these decisions. And that is why a human rights based approach is so important, because it puts the emphasis on the individuals and communities that stand to suffer because of the import or international trade in highly hazardous pesticides. Now, the fact that industrialized countries have responsibility does not mean that developing countries are off the hook, as it were. Developing countries also have a duty of protection to people in their jurisdictions. And so, accordingly, they should put an end to the import of highly hazardous pesticides. However, as I've mentioned, invariably there are lack of capacities to effectively regulate. There's lack of information on hazards. There's lack of capacity for assessments, and all this invariably it opens the doors. It enables a corporate capture because industry does have the information and it does have the capacity for assessments. So, despite shared responsibilities, what we see in the international landscape are that approaches are fragmented, voluntary, and largely ineffective. And as a result, we see the continuing adverse impacts on millions of peoples affected by exposure to hazardous pesticides worldwide. I also wish to say a few words about the country visits that I had the opportunity to conduct to South Africa by invitation of the government in 2023. Last year, in 2024, I reported on this visit to the Human Rights Council and the government in its response in the interactive dialogue that followed the presentation of my report said that it accepted the findings and it is working to implement the recommendations of the report. So please allow me to share a couple of the findings. I have 6 points to make and then a couple of recommendations. One, the Fertilizers, Farm Seeds, Seeds and Remedies Act 36 of 1947 is outdated, fragmented, and allows the import of hazardous pesticides that are banned in their countries of origin. So it is high time for reform of this instrument. Secondly, at the time, it was not possible for the public to access free of charge the list of pesticides registered for use in the country. All this while CropLife, an industry association, has an online database for purchase. Third, consultants not registered with the South African Council for Natural Scientific Professions have been involved in the preparation of applications for the registration of agricultural pesticides in open breach of the Natural Scientific Professions Act of 2003. Fourth, lack of information and lack of adequate monitoring of storage of hazardous pesticides, as exemplified by the fires of United Phosphorus Limited facilities facility in the singular in Durban, where thousands of tons of pesticides and other chemicals burned for days. Fifth, the death of children poisoned by street pesticides that are used to combat rampant rat and cockroach pest infestations that spread in the absence of sanitation services and informal settlements. And lastly, the decision to ban chlorpyrifos, a hazardous organophosphate pesticides. So these are some of the findings of my report. The recommendations in the same report, they have a distinct section on pesticides, and there are many, so I will only highlight the following three. The immediate and safe destruction of pesticide containers and stockpiles of obsolete pesticides instead of prolonged phase-out periods. And secondly, to ensure access to sanitation services in informal settlements to eliminate demand for street pesticides. And third, to promote sustainable agricultural practices and small farming. Time is always at a premium and it flies, so please allow me to conclude by offering three reflections of the importance of the work of the South African People's Tribunal on Agrotoxics. First of all, there's a critical value in efforts to raise awareness and visibility of lived experiences, especially people that have been affected by exposure to hazardous pesticides. And this is because what is visible can be addressed. What is invisible is very hard for us to tackle. Secondly, the tribunal offers an invaluable space to hear and elevate the voices and testimonies of persons who have been affected. And this is, as it were, solidarity in action, a real expression of solidarity. And third and last, the forum provides a space for critical analysis and discussion of alternatives so that policies and measures may be adopted to address the global toxic crisis, to address the local toxic crisis that arises because of the rampant use of highly hazardous pesticides, and so that the human rights abuses and discrimination may come to an end. Thank you very much for your attention. I wish the People's Tribunal a most productive and fruitful session.